Welcome to this Aztlander presentation. Another great presentation with a great presenter. The Maya Great Year, an astronomical key embedded in the Palenque tablet of the cross, with Dr. Michael Grofe of Sacramento City College. Enjoy!
Okay, so the title of my paper, I'm going to try and move some faces around here. That occasionally changes where you can see things. So if you can't see something, make sure to move the little box with everybody's face in it. So the Maya Great Year, an astronomical key embedded in the Palenque tablet of the cross. You can see my Gmail down there. If you want to contact me, my private Gmail address is there. So let's get going here. And I have a little bit of a video here showing the tropical year and the seasons. And so one of the challenges in presenting these topics is most people are familiar with the year, a tropical year, basically a seasonal year, returning the poles of the Earth to the same orientation relative to the sun. So in this case, the Earth is being shown in its position where the southern hemisphere is experiencing the summer solstice, where the northern hemisphere is experiencing the winter solstice. If you fast forward it a little bit to this point here, let's see if I can, this would be approximately where the equinox would be, where the two poles are of equal distance, the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere. Then we have here, this would be approximately the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, where the North Pole is pointing towards the sun. So what we're seeing is what most people understand about the year. And of course, we can continue over here, and we get to the point right about here, where this would be the autumn equinox in the northern hemisphere, or the spring equinox in the southern hemisphere, where the two poles are again equidistant to the sun, which is, we actually just went through an equinox, not the autumn, but the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere. And so in explaining what is happening here, most people will understand that the Earth goes around the sun in a year. Not that ancient people necessarily understood that in that way at all, of course, until the Copernican revolution, at least in the West. And I'm not suggesting that the Maya understood that the Earth went around the sun. We know that it does this now, and we have this heliocentric model of the solar system. But this is not the only thing that happens in terms of the Earth's movement around the sun. And this is a little diagram I created where if we look at this little blue circle, which represents the sun, and of course, just like the last illustration here that I showed, it is, of course, not to size, right? We all know that the Earth is not that big and the sun is not that small. But in this case, once again, it's not to size. And the Earth's orbit actually isn't a perfect circle around the sun, as Isaac Newton illustrated. But in this case, the Earth is here represented by this blue circle, the sun in the middle, and we'll look at the way in which we can observe from the point of view on the Earth when the sun moves in front or appears to move in front of an asterism. And here I'm just creating a hypothetical asterism that in this case would be behind the sun. So the sun is effectively blocking out certain asterisms like the Pleiades, which fall along the path of the ecliptic, which is basically the path of the observable path that it looks like the sun is moving through the stars, and it follows the path of the zodiac, which is why we have the zodiac there, the wheel of animals. But in terms of observation, you of course can't see when the sun is blocking a constellation behind it, like the Pleiades. But you can see it's first when it starts to disappear on the horizon before sunset, and then when it again reappears on the horizon in the east, which is called the heliacal rise of a particular constellation. And we know that the Maya were and do continuously observe these types of asterisms and the heliacal risings and settings of them. And if you read Barbara Tedlock's book, Time in the Highland Maya, she does talk about these asterisms. And they not only did this observation in terms of the opposition to, the heliacal rising or setting of constellations, but also when they were at opposition. So basically when you're looking out away from the sun at sunrise and sunset. But in this case, just for our purposes, let's take a line and look from the Earth basically through the sun as it points to an asterism that is either right before its disappearance or right after its reappearance, as the Earth then proceeds to go around the sun. So we think of the Earth going around the sun in 1 year and returning to the same position relative to the stars, but that's not exactly the case. And you can see that the Earth here has returned very slightly short of where it was in the beginning. And this is the actual meaning of a tropical year. And so the tropical year where the poles are of the same distance relative to the sun, where they return to the same distance, for instance, on an equinox or a solstice. That is a tropical year, and it is not exactly the same as the sidereal year. So if we draw a line from the observation point of the Earth, it basically looks like in a year that we're returning to the same position relative to the stars, but we are not. In fact, it's off just by a few minutes, and it takes about 71, 72 years for you to notice there to be 1 day of difference between the timing of the rising or setting heliacally of a constellation like this. And so that's why I have this line is very slightly different. So that green line would represent the tropical year, the return of the Earth to the same position in the seasonal year, such as a solstice or equinox. And the pink line here represents a sidereal year, which actually would return the Earth to, oh, this is just explaining the tropical year. The sidereal year returns the Earth to its same position relative to the fixed stars. Well, let's again look at this difference. The tropical year, which we measure currently as the mean tropical year, or the average between the measurements of the tropical year. Again, this is an average measurement taken at the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes. And surprisingly to many people, when you measure a year from spring equinox to spring equinox, you'll get a different measurement than when you measure the year from summer solstice to summer solstice, or from winter solstice to winter solstice, or from autumn equinox to autumn equinox. And the reason for that is rather complex, but it has to do with the fact that the Earth is in an elliptical orbit, but the Earth actually is wobbling as well. And that little bit of wobbling, which is called axial precession, it causes the tropical year to catch up a little sooner as it moves around in its orbit. And depending how fast or how slow the Earth is moving, depending on how close or how far it is from the sun, it will actually give you a slightly different value. So that changes over time as well. The tropical year actually changes quite a bit because the wobbling of the Earth is changing over time, and the year is actually getting shorter. But the sidereal year, if we move the Earth again, take a look at that slight difference. If we move the Earth to its same position relative to the fixed stars, that is actually a very regular motion and does not change very much over very, very long periods of time. In this case, the sidereal year by our current measurements is 365.25636 days. It's a little more than a quarter of a day longer than 365 days, whereas the tropical year is the mean tropical year right now, and the epoch of what we call J2000, when these measurements were taken right at the turn of the millennium. It's about 365.2422 days. So it's a little short of a quarter day of a year, which is why when the Gregorian calendar was updated actually by Pope Gregory the 13th, I believe, in the 1580s, there were 10 days actually that needed to be subtracted in order to adjust it from what was being used, which is a straight Julian year, which is 365.25 days when we add 1 day every 4 years. Okay, so if we look at heliacal risings like this, the rise of the Pleiades, this is something that Maya farmers actually continue to use today to time the planting season and the arrival of the rains in late April and early May. So the reappearance of the Pleiades continues to be an effective asterism that is used for farming. And I think it has been used, I think we can venture to say that it has been used for a very long time. And it's precisely these kinds of measurements that could allow for accurate measurements of the sidereal year. Okay, a little bit of explanation about precession. This is just showing how the axis of the Earth is pointing towards, right now, Polaris in the North Star. But it wasn't always so, and there is a cycle of the wobbling of the Earth where this wobble takes about 26,000 years to go in a complete cycle. So 13,000 years ago, the axis of the Earth was actually pointed up towards the star, which is Vega. Now it's pointing towards the North Star, but the North Star was not always the North Star. The effects of this are a little complex, but what it ends up doing is it ends up moving the position of the stars during the tropical year. So if we look at this little film that I created using Starry Night, you can see that the point here is showing the point of the vernal equinox. And this is as if we could look at the stars behind the sun, which of course we can't do directly. But you can see how the position of the spring equinox is precessing or going backwards through all of the zodiac in a cycle of 26,000 years. It takes about 2,000 years for it to go backwards into the previous constellation. And so this is now going far forward in the future. I had to catch it up a little bit, so it's a little jumpy and awkward because this is using a measurement of the tropical year, which of course changes over time, and Starry Night has calculated that into its program. But we're returning all the way back to where the equinox was thousands of years ago. In 26,000 years, it returns to the same place in the stars. So if we again look at this again, we start in Taurus, and where the equinox was back in ancient Egypt, it's precessing into Pisces, where it is now, and it's moving towards Aquarius, which is where you probably heard from Hare. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And of course, Madame Blavatsky and lots of spiritist ideas or New Age ideas about what precession means astrologically. But what is happening physically is the Earth is wobbling on its axis. And so the timing of which, when we see particular constellations at a given time of year, changes. Now, the question, of course, is did the Maya understand this? And this has been something that I have dedicated many years to trying to investigate with some success. Okay, if we look at what was going on in ancient Egypt, for example, this is now in Giza, outside of Cairo, the Egyptians used the sidereal year, or at least one version of it, by their measurement for the year. They did not have a measurement of the tropical year, actually. They used a measurement of the rising of the brightest star, Sirius, in the sky, which is what we're looking at in just a moment. Here is Orion. Here, Orion, the three belt stars point downwards, and we'll expect to see Sirius rising somewhere. There it is. So the Egyptians, for thousands of years, were timing the flooding of the Nile to the rising of Sirius. And for them, Sirius is known as the goddess Sopdet, and her name actually, Sopdet, we're not sure the vowels in there. This is an abjad, but her name actually means triangle or sharp one. And the reason being is if you look at three stars here from Procyon to Sirius, and then Sirius up to Betelgeuse, and Betelgeuse down to Procyon, it makes a really lovely equilateral triangle. And this is what Sopdet represents. And Sirius is the brightest star in these, and so it's quite easy to actually look at and anticipate the location of where Sirius will be. And so this is what the Egyptians used. And of course, they're using it for a tropical year phenomenon, which is the seasonal movement of the monsoons, which fills the Nile and their only source of fresh water. And so, of course, they were very interested in, and still are today, in when the Nile floods, although they've dammed it up quite a bit at Aswan. So the Egyptians were using the sidereal year for their year, and they called this the Sothic year. The Greeks called it the Sothic year. Sothos is a Greek, basically a Greek approximation of Sopdet, and Sothos is another name for Sirius. And so the Sothic year is basically a year of 365 and a quarter days. And because Sirius is actually quite a bit far south, here is east on the horizon. Sirius is south of east in this case, quite a distance. It doesn't quite look like that here, but only the stars on the ecliptic actually follow the regular sidereal year. Stars far south of the ecliptic, like Sirius, actually don't follow a sidereal year quite exactly because of the way the Earth wobbles. And interestingly, Sirius continues to rise on the same date throughout thousands of years with just a variation of a couple days. And that also has to do with the dynamics of precession. But my point here is that the Egyptians understood that the rising of Sirius was a signal to the tropical year flooding of the Nile, but they were not using a measurement of the solstices or the equinoxes in that way. So the thing about the Egyptian calendar is that it's a civil calendar of 365 days without a leap year, which should sound familiar to you because that's very much like the Maya Haab, if not identical. It's two different cultures and different parts of the world coming up with the same idea. It's quite interesting. So obviously we know, with the civil calendar of the Egyptians lacked a leap year, so they didn't correct with a leap year actually until far into the Hellenic and then the Roman period when they started to correct with a leap year. But for thousands of years, they apparently kept their civil calendar, which fell behind one day from the Sothic year. So after 4 years, the Egyptian civil calendar would fall back one day behind the rising of Sirius. The Romans it was Censorinus actually in 238 AD who wrote a book called De Dei Natali. I'm not exactly sure the Latin pronunciation. De Dei Natali, or having to do with the natal year, it's called. And he was explaining this about the Egyptian calendar, which lacked a leap year. And he called it the Annus Vegas, or the vague year, or the wandering year, because it fell consistently fell backwards one day every 4 years from the actual seasonal year and the sidereal year, which, was the rising of Sirius in this case. New Year's Day for the Egyptians was on the day 1 Thoth, named for the god Thoth, in the season of Akhet. And Akhet literally means flooding or inundation. And the flooding only really happens to coincide with the rising of Sirius. So this day, 1 Thoth in Akhet, would actually fall quite a bit far off of the actual date of the flooding. And so the Sothic year is a year that we now call the Julian year. Well, let me go backwards here. I meant to go this way. The Sothic year was a year of 365 and a quarter days, and it was later that under Julius Caesar, that became a regular institution of the Julian year, which was then used up until the 1500s, until the Gregorian calendar was instituted. But in this case, it followed quite closely the rising of Sirius, the sidereal rising of Sirius every year, and predicting again the rising of the Nile. So 1 Thoth only would return to the heliacal rising of Sirius, which was on July 20th in 139 AD. It would only do that after a period of 1,461 of the 365-day civil calendar, which equals 1,460 of these Sothic years, or these Julian years. And this great cycle actually is what Censorinus referred to as the Annus Magnus, or the Egyptian Great Year. He had a number of other names for it, including the Kunikon, which referred to the dog star Sirius, as well as the Year of God, and the apocastasis, actually, which is the bringing back into harmony of this great cycle. So it's a very long cycle which only returns that 1 Thoth on the flooding of, which is supposed to coincide with the flooding of the Nile, with the actual rising of Sirius. And it only happens every 1,461 of these years. So if we look at this illustration that I got from R. Sawyer's website, you can see the rising point of Sirius originally, well, this is just a little bit, I'm blocked now with faces. To explain the Egyptian civil year, a year of 365 days, without a leap year, drifts back about 1 day every 4 years, and it's called the vague year, or the Annus Vagus, the wandering year. So if we look over here on the left, we can see that this was the point of the new year, the Egyptian New Year, in the month of Thoth, and the Egyptians had 12 months of 30 days each, with an additional 5 days or epigonal days that were added to make 365, very much like the Wayeb. So this is a 365-day year where 1 Thoth begins the new year, and it did coincide with the rising of Sirius on the 20th of July in 138 AD, according to Censorinus. And he calculated that it must have taken the great year of 1,461 of these 365-day years to once again return to that position. And he said this was a cause of great celebration when finally the Egyptian civil calendar coincided with the rising of Sirius once again, and it had not done so in 1,461 of these years. This is a way that many Egyptologists have used to try to calculate the actual dates in the past for early kingdom, middle kingdom dynasties, and so on, and kings, because they didn't often use much more than just the day of the particular year when events happened. And then they would also commemorate the timing of Sirius, which would happen at a number of other points in time. So it's quite possible that this calendar was instituted about 1,461 years before this, although some people have proposed that it actually goes back 2 cycles of 1,461 years. What we don't know for sure is whether the Egyptians actually changed or corrected this calendar over time. Certainly when Akhenaten had a major reform and abolished the Amun priesthood, that would have been a time in which the calendar would have changed significantly. And so if you do calculate about 1,461 years before this period, you do reach that time frame of around Akhenaten. So it may in fact have been right then that you start to see this cycle instituted. Okay, so just a little bit of a definition here. Akhet refers to inundation or the flooding of the Nile, which began originally on the first day of the month of Thoth. And so, of course, that would not coincide with the flooding of the Nile, as this would fall back one day every 4 years. All right, where are we now? So the Maya, of course, and Mesoamericans throughout, so including the Aztec, including the perhaps even the Olmec before them, but certainly the Zapotec, they all had a calendar of 365 days. And so the Maya divided that not into months of 30 days like the Egyptians, although they certainly did track lunar months separately. But the Haab is divided, as many of you know, into winals of 20 days each, with an additional 5-day period of Wayeb tacked on to the end to make 365 days. So just like the Egyptian system, this is a 365-day cycle that repeats without any intercalary addition of a leap year. And therefore it drifts back from the actual tropical year about 1 day every 4 years. And again, many have taken the name of this, the Haab, they often call it the vague year, named directly after the Annus Vegas in Egypt, which is analogous to this system. So if we look at the Maya system, we can place the first of Pop, or the new year, or if you like, the seeding of Pop, 0 Pop, right here at this position. And if you mark the time of the tropical year, let's just say, in this case, we'll place Pop on the spring equinox, just for hypothetical purposes. So if this is on the spring equinox, and then we start counting, we then will have to count, if we are using the tropical year, we would have to count 1,507 years for it to return to the exact same position in the tropical year. Now, did that actually, was that actually in the awareness of Maya people, is a huge question that many have tried to answer, including Eric Thompson and John Teeple back in the 1930s and 40s. I think as early as 1927, Eric Thompson suggested that the Maya knew about this 1,507-year cycle based on some interesting dates in Palenque, including in the cross group. And although he then later abandoned that idea, saying it was far too exact of a measurement of the tropical year, it would have been the most accurate in all of human history up to this point. But he suggested that it was far too accurate for such an early time in Maya history. In fact, he originally proposed that the creators of the long count itself were looking at measurements of the tropical year. So he abandoned it in favor of some other measurements. And it was actually John Teeple later on who first then took a little more serious look at some examples in Copan and came up with another estimate of a tropical year value. But Teeple in 1930, actually, he died actually, I believe in that year or right around the time, right when his amazing treatise on Maya astronomy was published. He started looking at various dates along with Thompson, and he called these determinant dates. One of the first ones that he looked at was in Copan and Stela A, which is here in my drawing of that monument. And he took this date here. You can see it's the date, which is 18 Kumku, or Bishol, as Barb and I have translated, which would have been the classic version, one of the classic names of this month. This is, again, similar to the base date of the long count, which is on the date 8 Kumku. And 8 Kumku is different from 18 Kumku by 10 days. And this interested people because he looked at this unusual initial series date. And then he found later, inside the text of this monument, the turn of the Katun, in this case, the 15th Katun, which fell on the date 4 Ahau and 13 Yash. And he proposed that the actual date here of 18 Kumku would have corresponded with the actual position in the seasonal year on the turn of the Katun, and he called these dates determinant dates. This was a really popular idea that Thomson picked up on, and they started looking at many different Maya monuments, trying to determine all of these determinants. And this idea, though, of course, was proposed before the historical interpretation of the texts really came into being, after Tatiana Proskoryakov and others really began to see that these stela were not just about time and astronomy, as Thomson and Teeple had proposed, but they, of course, include records of kings and queens and wars and all sorts of other things. And with the historical approach that really began in the mid to latter part of the 20th century, it really started to cast doubt on this idea of determinants, this idea of these dates that had astronomical significance. Nevertheless, I think there's still a lot of value in looking at this, and if any of you were attending the presentation that I had on Yashkin, this is something that I've certainly investigated elsewhere with some success. But this is what John Teeple's calculation was, that from the base date, which was on 8 Kumku, he was suggesting that, by the time you reach the 15th Katun of the 9th Baktun, that the Haab had drifted significantly so as to place 18 Kumku far away from where it would have been in the seasonal year, whereas the Katun here actually would have fallen in a position that would be equivalent in the tropical year where 18 Kumku fell in the base date year, so the era base date. It's a little complex to think about. But his calculation was basically 1,403,990 days, equivalent to 3,844 tropical years. And I have since called this Teeple's Copan tropical year, which works out to 365 days, 0.2419355. And so that's very, very close to the actual current measurement of the mean tropical year, which is 365.24189, I believe. And so many people have suggested this is far too accurate. If this was the case, this is even more accurate than the Gregorian interpretation of the tropical year, which works out to 365.2425 days. So in this case, the Copan tropical year that Teeple calculated would be a little short of the actual mean tropical year, whereas the Gregorian calculation is just a little tiny bit long, but this one's closer. So there's still a lot that remains to be analyzed about, whether the Maya understood these measurements of the tropical year. And if so, at what point were they measuring them? How did they measure them? As I explained before, it really depends on what position you measure the tropical year from, say from in the tropics, one of the two zenith passages, which would allow for a quite accurate measurement of the year. We know that the Maya and Mesoamericans had access to zenith passages where in the Old World they did not, except if you go to far southern parts of Egypt down into Nubia. So back in Europe and the Old World, they did not have zenith passages. So one of the possible proposals that many have suggested over the years, including Celia Natal and others, they have proposed that the Maya may have been using measurements like the zenith passage to calculate the tropical year. But again, the actual measurement that you get is going to depend on what time of year you start taking that measurement. And so it puts a little bit of a wrench in the works of how we can try to analyze this in the data that's left behind by Maya records. Well, Hans Ludendorff, or Friedrich Wilhelm Hans Ludendorff, from 1873 to 1941, was a German astronomer and astrophysicist. He was the director of the Astrophysical Observatory of Potsdam from 1921 to 1938. And it was at that time that, in fact, he met Albert Einstein at the Potsdam Astronomical Conference in 1921 when he was first starting out as the director, although he had worked there for many years before, I understand. And so he did a number of things, actually, looking at binary star systems in Mizar, in the Big Dipper, a number of other analyses of light waves, a number of things that you imagine, an astrophysicist would do, and friend of Einstein. But he also had a hobby in looking at Maya inscriptions. And he wrote, I'm going to probably butcher this, but Die astronomischen Inschriften aus den Tempel des Kreuzes in Palenque in 1938. Right at the time he was retiring from his position. And he was really quite extensive in analyzing many of these inscriptions. And he was using, though, the Spinden correlation, and he was not using the GMT correlation, which most archaeoastronomers use today with some slight modifications. And so Thomson, of course, who was part of the GMT, he's the T in GMT, Thomson resoundingly dismissed a lot of, if not all of Ludendorff's work. And many of the things Ludendorff proposed, I think, are certainly inaccurate, especially looking at positions of planets and actual times of year and that type of thing, and lunar observations. But some of his information actually still holds up. And I think it really we owe it to ourselves to look, and we owe it to him, as we owe it to Maya astronomers themselves, to really look at some of the things that Ludendorff had found. And I actually was unaware of Ludendorff's work until Carlos Barrera Atesta. He introduced me to Ludendorff's work, and I had been doing things that Ludendorff had already done. And I was a little disappointed to find out that I was not the first to find some of these things out, such as about the sidereal year. But Ludendorff had done it way back in the 1930s. So a little bit about my own work. I began looking at the Palenque inscriptions and many other Maya inscriptions and looking for what I called sidereal parallel dates, or dates which connect two particular positions of the sun and replace the exact same, the position of the sun exactly in the same position against the fixed stars. So essentially giving us some clue that the Maya astronomers may have understood the sidereal year. I kept on finding these over and over and over again, especially in Palenque. And it turns out Ludendorff had already, way ahead of me, done the very same thing. And Carlos Barrera Atesta also was onto this as well. I believe after he read my dissertation and we corresponded quite a bit, he had found a number of these, which I also stumbled upon. And Hutch Kinsman as well, who was looking at meteor showers, which followed the sidereal year, had also been barking up this same tree. And we all have come across the same data. And I think this is a really good example of intersubjectivity with Ludendorff, myself, and Carlos Barrera Testa, as well as Hutch Kinsman, all coming to very similar conclusions that the Maya were calculating the sidereal year. And this table just shows some of those dates in black that Ludendorff was using. There are a number of his dates that I should say are incorrect that I've left out of this table. And there's some additional dates in here that I found, as well as Carlos Barrera Testa and Hutch Kinsman. Hutch Kinsman found these dates here in blue, and I'm very grateful for him sharing that with me. And so what you can see here is calculations of basically how these two different paired dates position the sun exactly in or very close to the same position, some of them off by a little over a day, but most of them all under a day. And it's these down here that we're going to be looking at, these ones in green, that Ludendorff actually did not find, and because he calculated some of the dates in the Palenque inscriptions incorrectly. So having looked at a number of sidereal parallel dates in the Palenque inscriptions, I was planning to write my dissertation about that, but I felt like it wasn't strong enough. I needed to find more evidence. I wish I had found Ludendorff at that point back in 2007 when I wrote my dissertation. But instead, I focused on the Serpent series, the chapter in the Dresden Codex, because I had found in there these preface numbers, which I took to be distance numbers. There had been other calculations of these prior to myself, such as done by Vicky Bricker and her husband. Um, and so, and so in this case, the reading that I have for these particular dates are dates that correspond to about 15,009 sidereal years. They would place the sun exactly in the same position, but over extremely long periods of time. And I believe it was Susan Milbrath who first proposed that these really long intervals of time in the Serpent series, in excess of some of them 34,000 years, that they may correspond with the precession of the equinoxes in some way, because, for example, as we know in ancient Greece, Hipparchus was one of the first that we know of to ever propose that the precession of the equinoxes was taking place, and that the tropical year fell backwards from the sidereal year, and he proposed it was by about 1 degree every 100 years, which would mean that the entire cycle of precession would be about 36,000 years. And I think that's what led Susan Milbrath to propose that these really long intervals of time in the Serpent series might be about precession. I then started to tackle that, and instead of looking at precession per se, I started to find more and more examples of the sidereal year, that this isn't necessarily about the tropical year, this is about the sidereal year. I also think, if you read my dissertation, that they were using the Köppen tropical year that Tipel proposed. And this, of course, is from the Dresden Codex, which is written many hundreds of years after the classic period when Köppen Stela A was erected, that Tipel was using for his tropical year. And so I actually think that over time they were improving upon their measurements. And I don't want to talk too much about the Serpent series, but just to give you a little bit of background about how I have entered into this, looking specifically at how the Maya were apparently measuring the sidereal year, and that was something that I have been onto for a while. After my dissertation, I started looking at many other texts, including Naranjo Altar I. And in this really marvelous text, which is an early classic text, you see a number of dates, and the dates that really interested me were historical dates that were tied to historical kings, like in this case, Ahwosal, although I think there's a different reading of his name now. His name is actually here and here. And so this particular date, 7 Kayab and 7 Kaban, 5 Kayab, counts backwards by this very clear distance number, which is 2 Pictunes, 2 Baktunes, 2 Katuns, and 6 tunes. And then we've got the Wienals and Keens. I believe 3 Wienals, or is it 4 Wienals and 3 Keens? I can't remember in this case. But anyway, you can go read my paper about this. And it counts backwards to this particular date, which is then stated in the calendar around here as 13 Ish and then 12 Shul. And these two dates I noticed, this one historical on February 21st, 525 AD, and I'm using the GMT +2 correlation, which is 584285. I know some prefer the 86 correlation, which I do too. I actually prefer a 584285.5, and there's multiple reasons for that in terms of how the Julian day number system works. That aside, we can look at these intervals in a correlation-free environment, but in this case, I'm taking this particular date, plotting it in Starry Night, and this is how I stumbled across a lot of these sidereal parallels. I would look exactly at where the sun was positioned on this date. Again, this is not to say that the Maya were doing this exactly the same way. This is just one way that we can see the sidereal year visually. It's something that I'm a very visual person. So these astronomy programs allow us to look at something. We, of course, have to be very cautious about how the Maya were doing this, whether they were doing this, whether they're aware of this. But when we look at these two dates in Naranjo Altar I, we look at February 21st, 525, and then we count backwards the stated distance number to February 8th, 310 BC, which is very interesting because this hits what I call the canonical nadir on February 8th, which is a repeated date that you see throughout my inscriptions, including in the Dresden Venus table and a number of other places. This is what I wrote my Yashkin proposal about and presented that about this February nadir, February 8th being the agricultural new year for the Mopan Maya that Thompson actually found in the 1930s, I believe, as well as Raphael Girard, who found that the Chorti Maya still were commemorating February 8th as that beginning of their agricultural cycle. But here, what fascinated me is that not only does it count backwards to this February 8th date in the tropical year, suggesting that they knew very well the length of the tropical year, but it also counted back to a lunar node positioning the sun exactly at the position where you would find an eclipse, and it's just a couple days off of an actual eclipse event. And it also coincided with the heliacal rising of the planet Venus. But the thing that interested me the most about it is that these two dates position the sun exactly in the same part of the sky. So again, if we go back, this is now in February 21st, 525, note a different time of the tropical year. But what was the same counting backwards is the exact position with just slight variation. And Hutch-Kinsman measures this using longitude or celestial longitude, which is using fixed positions in J2000 and then projecting them back in time. I since have adopted that technique as well because I think it's a really accurate way to see how the sun is, what you're seeing visually here, exactly in the same position relative to the fixed stars, but the time of year has changed. So on to Palenque. So when we look at Palenque in the western part of the Maya world, of course, it's a very famous site for good reason. We look at the Temple of the Inscriptions and the palace, and we look over here to the east to the Temple of the Cross, and that is the topic that we are going to look at here. That I wrote about in my paper from 2022, or 21, I believe is when I published it. So here's some photos of the Temple of the Cross. Each of these thought to be commemorated by the son of Pakal, K'uk Bahlam I. And each of these temples dedicated to a different god, one of the three of the Palenque triad, this one dedicated to the god G1. All that's left of the very top part of the sanctuary is about half of the existing building, which originally had two corbelled arches that constituted two separate chambers. And then you have the inner sanctuary here where the tablets are found. And here I believe this is Linda Shealy's drawing. I believe, I actually don't have the attribution here, I'm sorry about that, but here's what the original building would have looked like, and these were thought to be really private sanctuaries for royalty. These wouldn't have been really public monuments. But you have here the west panel of the inner sanctuary and the east panel. We're going to take a look at that in a moment. And then the very central altar in the center, flanked by two panels with really wonderful, well-preserved text. So this is showing Linda Shealy's drawing of the central cross, which is why it has the name Temple of the Cross. The cross, of course, we know now is an image of the jeweled world tree, the Seba tree that I know Carl Calloway has written about quite a bit. Over here in the West Sanctuary Jam, you have an image that we'll talk about in a moment of K'uk Bahlam, who is actually shown repeatedly here as a child undergoing a particular ritual, and then later as an adult. He took many, many years. It took many, many years for his father, Kinich Hanab Pakal, to pass away at the age of, I believe, 79. And K'uk Bahlam II was in his 50s, I think, when he finally acceded to the throne. But here he is impersonating a founding, what I think is a mythical founder of the Palenque dynasty. This is the central altar once again. So much going on here that's absolutely beautiful. But here, of course, the sky band, and then what I believe is a skeletal image of G1 himself, who has the solar brazier on his head and the quadripartite image that Merle Green Robinson has pointed out with the stingray spine and the spondylus shell and this little crossbands doohickey, which is something that I'm very interested in. Okay, here's the West Sanctuary Jam. And if you notice, just in the upper corner here that I have highlighted in pink is the name that has been translated as a few different ways or read in different ways, and I'll show you a few proposals. This, I believe, was Linda and David Stewart's proposal, U Chan, with the U very clear, but then this being a stingray spine, thought to be pronounced as Kish, and then the snakehead, which is Chan or Khan in this case, of course. K'uk Bahlam pronounces it with a Ka, syllabically. So there are some interesting evidence of different Mayan languages influences in Palenque, whereas the Chorti and Cholti would pronounce it as Chan. So in this case, another proposal actually was U Kokan. Kokan is another name for a stingray spine, and this has also been a subsequent proposal. So U Kokan Chan or U Kokan Khan is another proposal. I actually think his name may have been U Kokan, that the Khan here may actually just complement the name of a stingray spine, which is actually Kokan, which I believe David Moramarin and I both think that this can be analyzed as Koch, or the tooth of Khan, a serpent, and that's how you can read it in Yucatec. So it may just simply be U Kokan, but I don't want to argue about that at the moment. But for our purposes, since it's easy to pronounce, I'm just going to call him U Kokan, which means the snake fang. So even though it's written with a stingray spine, the actual name of a spine is named after the fang of a snake itself. Okay, he is a legendary Palenque ruler purportedly from the year 993 BC. This would be putting him way back in Olmec times, or times akin to Aguada Phoenix and those ancient monuments that were taking place in the Usumacinta. Now, he may have been a historical king, but I have lots of reasons why I think he was actually a fictitious founder. One of them being that we don't see any other kings for over 1,000 years after U Kokan. And U Kokan is mentioned in the left side of the panel, on the western side of the panel. This is Jorge Perez de Lara's wonderful photo of the tablet of the cross, which is now housed in Mexico City, the Museo of Archaeology and Anthropology. So on the west tablet of the cross, we see an initial series date. I'll just walk you through some of these quickly. It's a date that, as many of you know, precedes the era base, which would be 130000 for Hawikomku, precedes it by a few years. And it gives the date 8 Ahau 18 Sec. That is given as the birth date of, first it counts back by the 819 day count here to a date 1 Ahau, and then 8, that says 8 Sots, it actually should be 18 Sots in this case. And then we have the birth date, and this is the birth date of the deity who has been named Muanmat, who David Stewart believes is a version of the maize god, and I think he's absolutely right about that. A local name of the maize god. The name has a lot more to it than that, but for our purposes, we'll just refer to this individual as Muanmat. We then go through a series of events involving G1, but I'm skipping forward now because I need to get to the very end of the text here. And we skip forward to the date, from the day 1 Ahau 8 Sots, which is counting interestingly, from the 819 day count. And Herman Bayer was, I believe, the first to notice this, that if you do count with this distance number, it reaches an unstated date of 9 0 Yash, or 210142. That's not stated anywhere, but what is stated actually is another 9 Ik date, which is now known to be the accession date of Muanmat, which is mentioned elsewhere, and we know that date was not the 9 0 Yash date. It is a 9 0 Sak date, which is very similar, although it's off by a Katun and 4 Winals. So it's quite a bit distant from the actual date of the accession. And Ludendorff actually noticed that this date, this unstated date, 9 0 Yash, is basically an exact tropical year measurement from the era base to this particular date. And this also got my attention because 0 Yash is also the midpoint of the Haab calendar. And as the Brickers noted as well, 0 Yash is mentioned in the Water Table of the Serpent series. It's mentioned in a number of other places as that halfway point of the Haab. And I think that this was either an intentional calculation and a mistake for mentioning it in this case, but I do think that there's reasons to suspect that we can see some of the calculations in terms of astronomy. We can see some of the work that's left behind. Unfortunately, these would have been created most likely with the work of many years, and whether it was K'uk Bahlam II himself who was doing this or others, I think it was probably him. Gerardo Aldana believes, I believe, that it was him. And he's showing his virtuosity, but all we have left is this final product, and we don't see the codices and codices and the notebooks full of calculations of how they were calculating some of these dates. But I think that you can see what's left behind in terms of their math homework. Sometimes they leave us clues, and some of them may be intentional, some of them may not, some of them may simply be errors, and that therein lies the problem of doing a lot of this type of work. Okay, but if we count forward from this date, we have another distance number, but interestingly, this again counts from that unstated date 9-ik-0 Yash, and not from the accession of Muhammad, which is 9-ik-0 Sak. And if we count using this distance number and using 9-ik-0 Yash, we then reach a birth date for U Kokan. And his birth date is mentioned here, and then followed by his accession date with another distance number that leads to the date 11 Kaban 0 Pope. And we can now fix this in the long count and see that these dates actually are the dates that are stated, and that it is this 9-ik-0 Yash date that's being used as the basis of calculation for these distance numbers. And we can see that date then mentioned in the next panel. But I love that his name is the very last name that we read, the very last glyph that we read in the West tablet. And he is this interesting individual which seems to bridge the gap between this West tablet, which represents mythology. As far as we know, these are back-calculated mythological dates, but then he transitions to the other side. And so he is then mentioned, and then it says, and his white headband was fastened for him. And here's U Kokan, and then that date, which is that accession date, that 5-8-17-15-17. 11 Kaban, and very interestingly, it also caught my attention that this falls on the Haab New Year of 0 Pope. This tells me that there was calendrics going on, intentional calendrics used to calculate some of these things. And I love that this particular date of 0 Pope is the one date that transitions from the mythological side to the historical side. If we continue in the historical East tablet, it then counts forward in time to a date when we see the birth of who is most likely a historical character, K'uk Bahlam I, born in 8-18-0-13-6, 5 Kimi, 14 Kayab. Then we see an interesting distance number here highlighted in yellow. Hutch Kinsman has analyzed this and published it in the University of Pennsylvania journal Codex, in which he proposed that this is if you use it and calculate it with this other birth date, as well as I believe with the accession date of U Kokan. I can't remember exactly how Hutch did it, but I recommend reading that particular article. But Hutch noticed that it's a calculation of the sidereal cycle of Jupiter, I believe, along with the sidereal year, and I think he's absolutely right about that. It seems to be leading to nowhere, which is, I believe, what the title of his paper was, a distance number leading nowhere, or something to that effect. But we then see, again down here, the accession date clearly calculated for K'uk Bahlam I as 8-19-15-3-4, and this can be very easily determined, or maybe not so easily, but it can be fixed with the rest of these historical dates using the intervals with them and the dates that we know are associated with long count positions. So we don't see long counts directly stated here necessarily, although we can fix them in the long count. So we have now the accessions and the births and the accessions of two kings, which we'll be comparing. And when we look at these tablets together, I want us to focus on the birth date of U Kokan, which is again given here, and it's an unstated date, but that date would be 571184 Kan to Kumku. And that, if we use the 584385 or 584285 GMT correlation, that's 11th of March, the 11th of March, 993 BC. And that's in Gregorian proleptic, which is basically when you take the Gregorian calendar and back calculate dates to try and approximate the actual time of year, because the Julian calendar is quite a bit off. As you can see, the Julian calendar, which was being used at that time in Europe, would have been the 6th of April, 993. So I include both dates here. Astronomers often use just the Julian calendar, but many of us archaeoastronomers for Maya try to translate these into Gregorian proleptic dates. But if we then look at the east panel and we look at the birth date of K'uk Bahlam, who is this is now the accession date, my apologies, the accession date of K'uk Bahlam, 1 Kan to Kayab. What I noticed is that there's a tropical year parallel here. And Ludendorff did not know these because he miscalculated these particular dates in his lineup. So he gives us erroneous dates for these births. But we can now see that he was onto something in that he was finding tropical year parallels elsewhere in the text. But here is yet another one. So you can see that the accession date of K'uk Bahlam I falls on the 11th of March, but in the year 431 AD, or CE, if you prefer. And the birth of U Kokan, I think, was back calculated over 1,000 years before, on 11th of March, 993 BC, or BC, so quite a bit in the past. What this works out to is 1,999 Tzolk'ins, which is, you can notice, both of the dates fall on the Tzolk'in date 1 Kan to Kayab and 1 Kan to Kumku. They are separated just by 1 Winal in the Haab. This one, the birth of U Kokan onto Kumku, and the accession of K'uk Bahlam onto Kayab. That also caught my eye. And it caught the eye of Carlos Barrera Atesta as well, who had also found this very same parallel prior to when I found it, and he had self-published this in a number of papers that are excellent, and I recommend you reading them as well. So this is another case where a couple of us stumbled upon the same thing. And in this case, it wasn't Ludendorff who did it before me, it was Carlos. But I want to point this out, and I want to celebrate what Carlos actually found here. So 1,999 Tzolk'ins equals 1,423 tropical years. So the 11th of March here to the 11th of March here. And it's a period of 519,740 days. It is not small. So 1,423 tropical years, and those tropical years would be, and I just got it covered up by my little thing here, but it would be a tropical year of 365.242445 days. That's incredibly accurate. And if true, this is the most accurate measurement of the mean tropical year, of any tropical year in human history up to this point, prior to Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler in the late 1500s and early 1600s. So the date of the commission of this monument is somewhere around the late 600s AD. So quite a bit before Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. And I think that's really significant to notice and to celebrate and to give credit where credit is due, in this case, to Maya astronomers. So if we then look at the birth date of K'uk Bahlam I, here I've highlighted it in pink over in the east panel. That birth date is 8/18/013/6, 5 Kimi 14 Kayab again. And that date's the 31st of March in 397 AD. And what I noticed here, and Hutch Kinsman also noticed this as well, independently, we both noticed that this is a sidereal parallel date. So even though it's a different time of year, one's on the 11th of March, the other one the 31st of March, what definitely stands out for me when I was looking at this in anticipation for my writing my dissertation, this was one of those dates that I noticed that a sidereal parallel was evident. And so this means that the position of the sun was the same relative to the fixed stars. That is very, very interesting to me because now we have both tropical year parallel and we have a sidereal year parallel in this very same text in the individual that is crossing over between mythology and history. So if we look at the math for this, this works out to 507,342 days, equivalent to 1,389 sidereal years. And those sidereal years would have the value of 365.2570194 days, very close to the current measurement of 365.25636 days. Okay, one way to visualize this, we're looking now at where the sun was. Again, this is not to say the Maya were doing this. This is a way that we can look at this particular date to see what's happening. And compare it with this other date. So on the date of the birth of U Kokan Chan, or U Kokan, here I'm calling him U Kokan Chan. This is on the 11th of March, 993. I include the solar longitude here for, as Hutch Kinsman does when he's looking at his sidereal pair dates. And the solar longitude is 31.5 degrees to 32.5 degrees over the course of that particular day of his purported birth. And it corresponds, actually, I often put a tag on a particular dim star that is directly behind the sun in order to, this is before I knew about calculating solar longitudes, as a way of really seeing the repetition of these particular points in the sky using astronomy software. You can notice that the position of the vernal equinox is just a little bit past this point because this was in the 11th of March. And the vernal equinox is, of course, what we just passed on, I believe, the 20th of March or 21st of March. Okay, but notice when we then fast forward to the birth of K'uk Bahlam, these are now two births of two kings separated by some 1,400 years. The birth date of K'uk Bahlam here is on 31st of March, 397 AD. Notice it's a different time of year, but it is in the exact same position of the fixed stars. So solar longitude here, 32.2 to 33.2. I'll go back, whoops, so you can compare the two together. They are extremely, extremely close. That suggests to me the most accurate measurement of the sidereal year that's ever been stated for such an early time. And in fact, Hipparchus did not have as accurate a measurement. And in this case, they're using both sidereal and tropical year measurements, which would mean that when compared, you could get a value of the precession of the equinoxes. Not that I'm saying that they're doing that, but I'm saying that they could. And so if we go back over here, we can see the birth date of K'uk Bahlam, of U Kokan, and then the accession date of K'uk Bahlam I. And so in this case, remember, these were tropical year parallels before. But one thing that both I and Carlos Barrera Atesta noticed is that the Tzolk'in date here is just 20 days actually off of the Haab date. So this Haab date is just 20 days prior to another repetition of the date Tzolk'in. And when you look at that, and you go forward 20 days from this date, one kan Haab, the accession date of K'uk Bahlam, you will see a date that corresponds to the date 31st of March, 431, and it places the Haab exactly in the same sidereal position. And this was what was absolutely remarkable to me. And I don't know if Carlos, I think he noticed this parallel, but I don't know if he discussed this as a great year. But this is essentially something similar to what the Egyptians would have been doing with their great year. So the Egyptian great year that returns the Sothic year back to its position of the rising point of Sirius. In this case, I'm calling this the Maya great year, which is equivalent to the first time that the Haab returns to the same position, returns the sun to the same position of the Haab and the same position of the fixed stars. And that works out to 1,424 Haabs, which would be equivalent to 1,423 sidereal years, giving us a sidereal year value extremely close to what the current measurement is. And if you recall, that value of the sidereal year does not change significantly over thousands of years. It remains very, very stable in time. So that calculations into the past and into the future, if you have the measurement right, will end up looking quite accurate. And I think that is what is going on here. So it's 1,423 sidereal years of 365.2565 days. The current measurement is 365.25636 days. So it's extremely, extremely close to the current measurement. If accurate, again, this would be an achievement in the history of humanity. It would be the most accurate measurement of the sidereal year prior to the work of Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler in the 1600s, many hundreds of years later. If we look at the date that connects both the mythological panel with the historical panel, this is the accession date of U Kokan, which, if you might recall, was on that Haab New Year of 0 Pope. And this is something that caught my attention as an intentional calculation, or as I believe Floyd Lounsbury called it. What did he call it? He called these, in terms of this original initial series date, this back-calculated birth date of Muhammad, he called it a contrived number, because it was a number, an interval between the birth date of Kinich Hanab Pakal, on a date 8 Ahau, actually very much like this date, if you notice right here, and then the birth date of Muhammad, this maize god, who I believe Lounsbury and others in Chile at the time thought was a goddess. But apart from that, the contrived number is an incredible number that contains many known cycles, including the Tzolk'in cycle, including the canonical cycle of Venus, I believe, a number of other numbers that are factors in this, what must have been a contrived number in a back-calculated date going deep into deep time in mythology. I think what's happening here is our friend, K'uk Bahlam II, indeed, if he is the one who did these calculations, is leaving behind a really interesting clue. And this clue is in the form of this 0 Pope date, which ties these two dates together. And I briefly mentioned this in my paper, but I did not. I removed the section where I talk about this at length because it requires a little bit more attention, and I wanted to get the main point across, and Barb McLeod was very kind in being a principal editor of my paper, and she encouraged me to remove that part. But I will give you a little tidbit of what this is about, I believe. When you look at this date, 0 Pope, on the date of the accession of U Kokan, this mythological accession, what I believe is mythological, the 0 Pope New Year in this case is, of course, the Haab New Year. If you count back to the date 8 Kumku, prior to this 0 Pope date, that again becomes another sidereal parallel with the birth date here, as well as with this date here, the accession date of K'uk Bahlam, as well as this date here. So there are a number of sidereal parallel dates. And the reason why I believe they place it there, and if we can go back to the image, excuse me for just a moment, if we go back to this image here of where U Kokan Chan's birth is, the position here, if you look at this same sidereal position, but in the year of the era base, it falls on that February 8th nadir, which is that same date from Naranjo Altar 1, that same Maya New Year, agricultural New Year date, which is oppositionally directly opposite the August 13th date. I don't want to get into that too much more, but I think that's exactly why they were positioning the Haab New Year at this position. It was the year in which you find that 0 Pope date corresponds to exactly being 180 degrees off of where it was on the era base. And we see the same thing taking place with the tropical year, as Thompson found, and the birth dates of G1, G2, and G3, which I'm not mentioning in this paper. Okay, so the Maya Great Year, therefore, that I'm proposing is using the Haab cycle of 365 days. That cycle without a leap year drifts back from the tropical year and the sidereal year by about 1 day every 4 years. Others called this the vague year, the Annus Vegas, named after that same Egyptian year. But if we position the date of, let's see, the birth of U Kokan on 1 Kan 2 Kumku in the Haab, again, this is 11th March 993, and we look at that position in the sidereal year, we then would have to count forward by a total of 1,424 of these 365-day Haabs, and we then return the Haab position to Kumku to its exact same location, and that is the date at which we then see this commemoration, or this intervals, the historical intervals of K'uk Bahlam and this return of the Haab during the year of his accession. So it's a really interesting piece of evidence, I think, one of the clearest, if not the clearest, evidence that we have that the Maya were measuring the sidereal year as well as, you can see, the tropical year. A little bit more about this, this panel. So the East Tablet continues with a line of kings all the way up until K'uk Bahlam I, who was the namesake for the king who commissioned this, the son of Bakal, who was K'uk Bahlam II. But we get up to the birth date of K'uk Bahlam I. Here it's on 11 Chikjan, 13 Chen, and I've highlighted here in green. You might have to move the faces a little bit, like I'd have to right now. Okay, there it is. And then there is another distance number that you see here that leads to an unstated date. And here it's a little eroded in Linda Shealy's drawing of this monument, but you can see in Jorge Perez de Lara's excellent high-res photograph that this is actually 16 tunes here, and it takes us precisely to the date 95697, which is 5 Manik 15 Mach, which is an unknown date because it says at the bottom that after his birth date is the accession date for K'uk Bahlam I, but we actually have that date as a different date in other texts, and also it's as evidenced here in the other distance numbers as well. So what is this additional date? And Ludendorff, once again, had scooped me on this by many decades. He found that this date, and I found this many years later, the very first date in the initial series, the birth date of Muhammad, and the very last date, this mysterious date, which is tied together somehow with K'uk Bahlam I. This is another tropical year parallel of 3,660 tropical years. And I really love the way in which you have kind of a chiasmus of dates in this case. You have the first date and the last date as a tropical year parallel, and then you have the inner panel, right? The birth and accession of U Kokan and the birth and accession of K'uk Bahlam I as tropical and sidereal year parallels. So many of these dates, these significant dates showing up here in this monument are giving us very, very strong signals that the Maya understood very well by this point a measurement of the sidereal year as the most accurate for human history, as well as a measurement of the tropical year, which would have been the most accurate for human history up to this point as well. And I think that is an incredible thing that we need to celebrate. Even if we disagree with this possibility that it may not be the case, I think the evidence speaks for itself. And when we have a productive theory like this, and we have multiple people, Ludendorff, myself, Carlos Barrera Testa, and Hutch Kinsman, all coming to similar conclusions about different aspects of this, that gives us an enormous amount of intersubjectivity, of multiple people looking at this, at the same evidence and coming up with similar conclusions. And that's a really productive theory. So I am really grateful to know that there are others working on this same stuff. I know sometimes it's a problem about who discovered what first, but I really do think we need to give Ludendorff credit here. And I have a quote from his from 1938. "I do not believe that the Maya inscriptions would immediately reveal their astronomical meaning to someone who could read all hieroglyphs. Rather, the priest astronomers may have had manuscripts in which the real meaning of the data recorded in the inscriptions was explained in detail. The inscriptions themselves were supposed to remain incomprehensible to the people and also to the educated layman, so that they were only viewed with shy awe." And it brings the question, I think it's a really interesting statement, Why were they doing this? Why have such amazingly accurate astronomy in these mythological texts? Um, I think part of the reason is that they could do it, and they were quite proud of the fact that they could do it. Another possibility is that these were puzzles, puzzles meant to be solved, either by other nobility who were being tested, as we see in the puzzles of Suyua, the language of Suyua that we see in the Yucatan, which would test nobles about their understanding of time, the calendar, and mythology, and so on. And so I think that it's quite possible that these incredibly accurate scientific achievements, which were interwoven in this beautiful way with mythological information, mythological stories, they were giving charter to noble dynasties, giving charter to and legitimacy to kings and queens who not only could, calculate these types of things, but then also leave them as puzzles for others to calculate, just like we can today. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really good. Cheryl, funny you should chime in right now. But Michael, Cheryl's very interested in the first cycle as being the initiation of the Tzolk'in calendar at Izapa, and I found it very interesting what you had to say about the 9 place and blood moon and the 9 months of flood. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. Well, Jim had just asked me this before our presentation, everybody, and I had given a presentation for students at Rafael Landivar back in November, and as well as for colleagues in January, and that is a paper about the blood glyph in the Tzolk'in. And in that, it discusses the 9 place, which is an image that it's a conflation between the blood glyph, which is the cartouche surrounding the Tzolk'in dates, which we know says cheech or k'ik or blood. And it's a conflation between that and moon, and it's also half darkened in many cases. But the 9 place is given with the number 9, and it precedes that conflation of the blood and moon glyph. And then there's often a little curve in the top of the crescent moon, out of which you see these emerging footprints, or hul. And so it seems to say something like bolon hul kik, or bolon hul or bolon hul kik or something like that. So blood moon. And my proposal is that it relates to what a lot of Highland Maya people continue to call humanity as people who are born of 9 moons, so the length of the gestational period. So it's part of the gestational hypothesis of the 260-day Tzolk'in that was used and still used today for calculating and approximating the time of birth of a child from the date of the first missed blood day, or the first missed menstruation, which is why I think that blood glyph is used in the Tzolk'in cartouche in the first place. And so the 9 blood moons, I think that there are examples among the Quiche where they discuss how human beings are people made of 9 moons, of the 9 bloods that are missed, the 9 menstruations that are missed during the period of gestation. And so I think that it is an origin place, or a meaning of humanity, of being people of 9 bloods. The other one, I know John Carlson has written about this in his paper about the 9 place and the 7 place. The 7 place, he proposes, is related, I think, to the 7 caves of emergence. I think that's a good guess as far as central Mexican places of emergence, which may be a combination between central Mexican lineages and Maya lineages, where we know the dynasties in Copan, for example, Tikal, are hybridized between Teotihuacan and Maya dynasties. So that was part of that discussion. But that's a little bit of tangential from this particular presentation.
Right. But it is totally of interest to Cheryl. She's the wife of Garth Norman, who worked for
Oh yeah, uh-huh.
5 years or so at
Yeah, I knew Garth.
And you mentioned the helical rise of the Pleiades.
Yeah.
Um, is there a glyph for the Pleiades, or is there? How do you know that you're looking
That's a
at?
really good question. I think we know, for example, ethnographically, that the Pleiades, in the Yucatan at least, were understood to be the rattle of a rattlesnake or tzab.
Right.
And so I think the iconography in Chichen Itza is all about the rattle of that rattlesnake. And in fact, during the time when Chichen Itza was in power, the Pleiades were directly at the zenith above Chichen Itza at that latitude. If you go way back in time to the time of the creation of the long count, the Pleiades actually were across the zenith at the latitude of 14.8 degrees north, where you have the two zenith passages of the sun on August 13th and April 30th
Yes.
slash May 1st.
That,
So
yes.
that's
Well,
a
that,
really
that,
interesting possibility. And so when, in terms of the imagery of the feathered serpent with the rattle pointing directly at the zenith, in the Castillo, I think that has everything to do with when the sun is in front of the Pleiades it becomes invisible. That is announces the time of the zenith in May, I think around May 21st in Chichen Itza. And a lot of people, including this year, go to Chichen Itza to celebrate the vernal equinox and the serpent descending the stairs. But I think that serpent really was meant to descend the stairs on May 21st, when the zenith happens in Chichen Itza, when it also brings the rains. And so you have fertility, you have the serpent then descending the stairs, going towards the cenote, filling up the cenote with water. And I think Maya people and farmers had known this for millennia, most likely, all the way back to the times of Aguada Phoenix, right, and the Olmec times, that the zenith passage in late April and in May, depending on your latitude, announces the time of the rains, the time when you need to plant, and the intertropical convergence zone, which brings the monsoon. All of that, I think, is a complex that we see that's wrapped up together with the feathered serpent and in the form of a rattlesnake. But I think that, that differed most likely through time, and I don't know necessarily that they always saw it as a rattle. Some Maya groups see it as a fistful of maize. I think the Quiche see it as a handful of corn, again, associated with planting. So I don't know of any particular glyph that we could identify as the Pleiades, although there's been some proposals that in the serpent series themselves, there's, these images of rattlesnakes, which we know, of course, read och, or to enter. And this is something that Barb and I have worked on in terms of mathematical subtraction, using och, or entering into water, as a metaphor for subtracting time, which is a really interesting thing. Whereas patach, the verb to construct, appears to represent addition. And so there's these really interesting metaphors for mathematical addition and subtraction in the serpent series. And
I
I think we
think it
can
was
identify elsewhere.
interesting when you mentioned the inner sanctums there in the three temples of the cross, but being only for elites.
Uh-huh.
Were they like you mentioned, they were like classrooms? They were teaching and challenging.
Your guess is as good as mine in that case. I think we can see based on the location of these in these kind of elite complexes that these would have been restricted areas as far as I know. I mean, maybe multiple people were invited. The populace who knows? But in terms of understanding the meaning, astronomical meaning of what's written on there, it's sort of, to me, it's interesting in the idea that here is this monument which has lasted now thousands of years, or over 1,000 years, in which we can still read it, and it poses a puzzle for others to solve, a tantalizing puzzle that many of us have been trying to tackle for years. I think it might have done the same thing for the Maya, if you consider that the Maya were using their writing system and their long count system for a period of over 1,000 years. This incredible system, which is analogous to our Julian day number system, which is Joseph Scaliger's system, which astronomers still use to this day, because you don't have to fuss with correcting the year with a leap year and all of that kind of thing. You just count an exact number of days between historical observations of astronomical phenomenon, and then you can get very, very accurate astronomical data over many, many, many hundreds of years, and you can refine that as they did in Europe and in China and in elsewhere. But in this case, this continuous count of days that the long count actually affords them, I think really is an amazing tool that they then were showing off in using to back calculate these times in, these mythological astronomical phenomenon to the best of their ability. And really, because they could, it's kind of an amazing, amazing thing, because they could see it in their mind's eye and calculate it in their mind's eye. And on paper, they knew what they were doing and trying to do, even though nobody had ever observed these things themselves. And they were able to calculate thousands, if not millions of years in some cases. I mean, you look at Temple 14, also a monument, most likely commissioned by K'uk Bahlam, which may have been his teen initiation into calendrics. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal calculation of over 940,000 years, I think, and counting into deep, deep, deep time. And these intervals of deep time are just so tantalizing to me, because they absolutely announce that they are contrived. We know that human beings must have calculated these to the day for some reason. And I think what we can do is analyze them, as I have, and others like Ludendorff and Carlos Barrera Testa and Hutch Kinsman analyze these dates for astronomical calculations. And they may not be exactly accurate and identical to ours. We should never expect that they would be. But what we can do is we can actually try to figure out what the values they used were. And that's why I think in my research, my methodology is looking at like the Naranjo dates, which compare relatively shorter periods of hundreds of years, counting back to 300 BC, then paired together with these longer intervals. And in fact, Naranjo Altar 1 has an even longer interval of deep time that I've written about, with the accession of the square-nosed beastie. And you have 3 of those different dates with different calculations in 3 different sites. Naranjo, and in Palenque is another one, and over in Copan as well. And what were they doing? And I think they absolutely were involving their best guesses for the best calculations for astronomical intervals of planetary cycles like Mars and Venus, which is the conclusion I came to looking at the square-nosed beast intervals. But what this tells me is that they also were able to understand the tropical year and the sidereal year and paint a picture of where the sun and the earth and the other planets were in the sky at any given moment in time to the best of their ability. And of course, when you do this over many hundreds of thousands of years, your intervals, if they are even just slightly off, are not going to be exactly accurate to what our current measurements are. But I think they're damn impressive. And so I think we have to celebrate and really entertain the reality that these were some of the major motivators for why they were so interested in these very precise intervals in deep time. And the tropical and sidereal years, I think, are 2 of the cycles that they were looking at.
Great. And we have a couple people that have raised their hand. But I know you didn't want to get into it, but have you found that the other births and mythological time of the G gods are they tied into tropical and sidereal?
Well, that's a good question. So I did look at the birth date of G1, in fact, and I have published that in a 2011 article in the Journal for, Archaeoastronomy Journal. And you can read that if you like. And in that proposal, I talk about the birth date of G1 as being smack dab in the middle of, if you go back and look at the sidereal position of the sun on that date, it places it right in front of the widest part of the Milky Way, which is, of course, something that John Jenkins was interested in. And, his name is, we haven't mentioned him at all in this presentation. And I think, part of what John had proposed, in that saying that the long count itself was calculated by astronomers who knew the sidereal and tropical years, who knew the cycle of precession, and predicted, if you remember what he had proposed, predicted that that 2012 would December 21st, 2012, the winter solstice would position the sun in front of the widest part of the Milky Way, and he thought that that was an intention of the creators of the long count, and I differed with him in that I don't think that we have enough evidence to say, but of course. He liked a lot of my work in that he saw it as supporting in his proposal, although that got me in trouble in some cases, I think, because John was certainly faced his critics,
Right.
um, some with good reason, that he combined together a lot of interpretations that I think were based on non-scientific proposals, but I also, critiqued some of his proposals, saying that we just didn't have so much direct evidence from ISAPA to say that the creators of the long count were intending to position this. But certainly he liked that, the birth of G1 did position the birth of G1 directly in that same position where you find the sun in 2012, which is interesting. I actually do think, and I argued in that paper, that the central icon showing the Ceiba tree, the cross, if you don't mind, I'll go back and show it again. Let's see, because I think it's worth taking a look at here. That central icon in the middle of the Temple of the Cross, which is all about the birth of this deity right here. Let's move this over here. This, I think, is a direct image of where they understood the sun to be. And so you see this, the sky band, which many have argued is the ecliptic itself. And then this skull, I think, is G1 himself. He is the one who wears the solar brazier on his head with the quadripartite badge. If you understand the Ceiba tree to be the Milky Way, which is what Linda Sheely had argued, and although many have since, critiqued that proposal, I think there is absolutely some merit to it. And this, if that is the case, I think what they are showing here is an image of that rebirth of G1. He is in his skeletal kind of deathly face, but he becomes refleshed as he passes through the underworld at night and emerges again. Anyway, in this case, I think that may in fact be the referent, and this icon itself may be from a reconstruction of what was going on the birth of G1, which, is that mythological date they mention in this text in the Temple of the Cross. So anyway, you can read that paper if you like, but
Thank
I,
you, and thanks for mentioning John Major. He was a major friend of mine. You're giving me goosebumps.
I know, and he was angry with me towards the end of his life because I didn't support his work and I criticized it, and I didn't. Whereas I agreed with him that I think absolutely we can find evidence, and this is what I'm presenting here, that the Maya understood the cycle of the sidereal year as well as the cycle of the tropical year, and I've been writing about that since my dissertation. But to take it a step further and to say that the whole long count itself was intended to, have this focal point of 2012 be its reason for being is something that I disagreed with him on. And he was pretty mad at me for that. And he was also mad at me for not being more forceful in getting my work out there, because he did see it as supporting his. But I also face my own difficulties with publishing this stuff because of the associations with the 2012 phenomenon and how that, became such a boogeyman in archaeoastronomy that I have been contending with for many years. But I think, time will tell. And so I think that really what we need to rely on is the evidence. That's what science is. And we have to actually look at what the texts themselves say. And I think that's really where, long after I'm gone, that I think this is really what the Maya were doing. And I think we owe it to the Maya astronomers who did this in the first place to give them due credit for something that's really quite extraordinary.
And
Michael,
Yeah,
Garth Norman agrees with you totally.
yeah.
He agreed with you totally with this, John Major Jenkins. But I want to just make you aware that at Izapa in 1500 BC, the Olmecs started the 260-day count on August 13th to April 30th at Izapa.
Yeah, that latitude is where you have the two different zenith passages, right? So
That's right.
absolutely, it's
And they
pretty interesting.
started it way early in about 1500 BC. And
That's interesting. That's a
you're
long time ago.
and
Yeah.
you're talking about 993 BC at Palenque, the dates that you mentioned
Yeah.
kind of coordinate with Izapa.
Yeah, well,
And
that's an interesting idea, that maybe he was a historical king in reality, but from what I can see in the Palenque texts, given his zero pope accession date and so on, and the way that this kind of astronomical key of this great year separates the historical king of K'uk Bahlam I with, U Kokan, my suspicion is that these dates are back calculated as well. But it is something that, that is worth entertaining, whether there were historical records for kings going back that early. I can't answer that definitively. My suspicion is that these are mythological founders of dynasties. But yeah, it does certainly take us back to the ballpark of, the pre-classic and the time of the Olmec.
uh-huh. The precession of the equinox is uh, ins inscribed on some of the pyramids or some of the stela at Izapa.
Yeah,
So
that was John Major Jenkins and Garth's idea, and so yeah, some of those things I think uh, are a little tricky and are open to interpretation, but I know that is certainly something that John Jenkins and Garth were very much a proponent of.
John
my
hired me twice to lead him to Zappa for his further research.
Oh yeah,
And we've been there a couple times with Garth and John while they were at the site together, especially
oh
at
yeah.
ceremonies there. All
yeah,
right, Chris, you want
Jim,
to, what's that?
Jim, can I just mention that 2 months ago I gave the presentation on Izapa, and if
Yeah.
everybody can watch that. That ties into what Michael's talking about.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank
Awesome.
you, Michael. That was awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Chris, you got your hand up and you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks again, Michael. Fantastic as always.
Thanks.
And don't forget, you always have a place to publish that in the journal.
I appreciate that. I'm going to take you up on that one day soon.
I hope so. I have a kind of a speculative question.
Uh-huh.
On the Western panel, if we have sidereal parallels, might it stand to reason that we're looking, perhaps maybe not at god names, but perhaps the names of particular asterisms? Could that be a possibility?
Well, that's a really interesting idea. I had not actually thought about that myself. So instead of a king named U Kokan, you're suggesting that this is an asterism.
Or a place, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's something that I hadn't thought of before, and it'd be interesting to see how that pans out, and whether it holds up. I think the way that you'd have to test that is looking at other examples of whether these
Yeah.
names show up elsewhere and do they show up with similar sidereal positions.
That was my follow-up question. Do we know, do they show up elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. I think my guess would be that place names, toponyms may in fact have astronomical reference in some cases. And I think, that three Hearthstone place or the
Right.
three, I know Barb has has another reading for that, and Michael Carrasco. I don't want to leak it right now, but I really want to. But the idea that, of course, we know, the three Hearthstones in the Quiche that Barbara Tedlock had actually been told about, and Dennis Tedlock from the Quiche Daykeepers, who see them as the three stars Alnitak, Saif, and Rigel in the lower part of Orion. One of them just as the belt star, and I've written about that too. Looking at the Köppen baseline, talking about historical incidents of on 9/11/000 when that asterism was rising, and I think it was exactly at the same the Orion Nebula in this case, which the Quiche considered to be the smoke from the first fire that was in the center of this hearth or this three stone place. that Orion Nebula I found was exactly at the azimuth of the Köppen baseline facing east, and at exactly on the same position, same azimuth that the sun rose in that position. And so I think they're connecting together, the birth of the sun in this, in this three Hearthstone place. There's some other interesting evidence with the Orion constellation and why that's so prominent in the creation or the long count era base that I know Carl Calloway, who's with us here, has worked on quite a bit. And I think, Hutch Kinsman's proposal about meteor showers, I think is something we really need to take seriously. And I think they show up quite a bit. I don't think all sidereal parallels are about meteor showers, but I think some of them most certainly must be. Because they do correspond to the height of very prominent meteor showers. Again, I think that it becomes a little bit problematic because there's so many different meteor showers per year. Which one are you going to pick as significant? But there's certainly some, like passing through the tail of Halley's Comet that we get, with the Orionids and the Aquarids, I believe, that are very prominent and can be incredibly potent or incredibly noticeable in certain years. And I think Hutch has some really wonderful proposals about whether the Maya were able to calculate the positions of Jupiter and Saturn, for example, that influenced the strength of these meteor showers. But one thing I think is really possible is that, this back calculated date of 4 Kumku, which, the founders of the long count, who may not even have been Maya, gave us. But the Maya certainly then associated it with, at least first in Köppen, or possibly first in Izapa, with this three Hearthstone place. The interesting thing to me about that is it coincides with an Orionid meteor shower, where you see, the point of origin of those meteor showers, the radiant, is right basically near Orion, in the top of Orion by his shoulders, I believe. And so is that a possibility that they understood that at least by the time when they were writing about 4 Kumku as associated with this three Hearthstone place throughout the Maya area, because it was a continuous referent, I think, and a shared cosmology, was that referent the Orion meteor shower that took place, we know, following the sidereal year? They would have had to have calculated and known about the sidereal year in order to back calculate that the Orion meteor shower took place on 4 Kumku. I think that's a really, really interesting proposal.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Antonio, you want to unmute?
Yes. Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for this great presentation. I know very well Carlos Barrera because we met every month on the Mexican Seminar of Archaeastronomy here in the National School of Anthropology.
Excellent.
I've been there for a long time, and I've been working these few years on constellations, basically the Maya constellations. So I have a couple of questions. The first one, I know you work also. You just mentioned Carol, and you published in the 2007, I think so, from Geraldo Aldana book. Something, yeah. She also writes about the turtle and the constellation with Palenque and Adir,
Yes.
which is very interesting. Also, I saw your paper of the Serpent series.
My dissertation.
Yeah, very, very interesting. The thing is, very few people now gets into this proposal of this great year cycle. Going on the very, very basics, I think it would be very easy to understand that cycle because one star moves, I don't know, every 2 or 3 generations, every 72 years. So I think it wouldn't be not a big problem to understand that movement in the sky. The thing is
I fully agree.
Now, what do you think, first question, what do you think the long count would be exactly? And I mean, the objective of the long count would be just for measuring the great year, because it's a fifth part of this 26,000 years. I mean, very easy. What do you think on that?
I think that we have to separate a couple things out. So there's the 26,000 year cycle of precession, which is, the offset between the tropical year and the sidereal year. But if we look instead at just the sidereal year, I think some really interesting things do show up. And I'm actually writing a paper about some of the potential origins of the long count from the year 76000, which was on a date 11 Ahau, but on the Haab date 8 Kumku. And that was something that John Teeple had originally proposed, that he saw that right before he died. He wrote to Thompson and proposed that he thought that the originators of the long count must have started in 76000, because it's a very rare commensuration of that 8 Kumku date with the era base 8 Kumku, which we know, is 17 days before the zero pope New Year, and why. And that's a really interesting idea. That's very tantalizing, and I would love to talk more about it, but I haven't published it yet. So invite me back, and maybe I'll talk about it. So,
Okay. I will, and then thank you. And I have another question. Would be, as I just mentioned, very few people talks about this great year. Now, also, not too many people gets into the constellation thing, which is in the Maya, for example. And there are two visions. I know that Brickers put their model on 1992 on the Colgate event. That also Paxton present a different model. But there's a work before that from Severin, which actually studies where we actually could expect to find these constellations on the Paris Codex, 24 and 25, which over there you find the animals. There's where we can expect
absolutely.
sidereal year. But Severin proposed it, and then Bricker came with another model. I would like to share you my work. This is my book of Maya constellation, and to everybody. And the purpose is to discuss it, because I agree that this sidereal year, as you find it for example, in Palenque, also appears in the shape of a rattlesnake, in the Paris Maya Code, in these constellations and the cartoon model, etc., etc., etc. But if the thing is, if you find the great year, this processional year, we can expect it in these 2 pages. I don't know if you can tell me a little bit about it.
Oof, well, that's
something.
much longer discussion. I'm very interested in the Paris Codex and the constellation proposals. And I know that there's a bit of disagreement about those. Bruce Love has his own proposal about the Scorpion. The Brickers have theirs. Yeah. And so the lights just went off here in my office, but hold on a second. Let's see if I can turn it back on. Oh, it's not that important, but here we go. So, yes, I would love to see what you've written about that. I have my own ideas about what goes where. I do think that the Pleiades is pretty consistently associated with the rattlesnake. And I think that that's a good place to start. I also do think that the Scorpion is associated with generally where we see Scorpius, which is interesting, although I think it's facing the opposite direction. And that what we see as the eye of the Scorpion is actually the stinger for the Maya, but I have my own ideas about why that is. I also have proposals about Yashkin and the location of Yashkin sidereally and in the tropical year in the original configuration of the Haab, which is associated with those with Altar 12, I believe, in Takalik Abach, where Barb and I have been on August 13th a couple of years ago, which is really quite fun with Ahpub, Pablo Garcia Ishmatar, and his wife Ishach. We went with my mom, and we had quite an amazing time, but I wanted to be there to take detailed photographs of the different Haab patrons that are depicted around. There are 16 of them, with 2 of them missing. And I think those are absolutely associated with constellations. The rattlesnake is featured in that one as well. And I was not the first to find that. I think that goes all the way back to some of the first people who were drawing monuments. I'm forgetting the name, but anyway, yes, I think there's a lot more to be said about that and about the Haab as being originally configured in the year 236 AD, which was that date of 76000, that date that Teeple proposed. And I have some direct evidence that that's the case, that I will be publishing soon, hopefully, knock on wood. Um, and uh, and associated with page 60 in the Dresden Codex, in fact,
Hmm.
so, which I think is a direct reference to 11 Ahau, 8 Komku, and some really incredible astronomy that shows up there too.
Wow. Okay.
And then, Michael, you mentioned Tagalika. Uh,
Yeah.
have you seen the little structure with the excavations of the two lines of stones in the middle of
I did, yeah. So I did.
that, that Miriam Popenoe thinks is evidence that they were tracking precession?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting proposal, a different proposal in terms of looking at the alignment of particular asterisms. I think it's in Draco, as I recall. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, no, that's also very interesting and an interesting proposal. But no, my knowledge about Izapa is mostly, around the fact that it's very close to that latitude where the two zeniths are, 260 days apart, like Izapa. But there's long counts at Izapa, not at Izapa, but at Taklikabar, and this evidence of this, the very first evidence of the Maya Haab we see there on Altar 12. So I think that stuff to me is like gold. So
Barb has looked up the exact coordinates, but I think Takalika Bak is actually closer to that than Izapa.
oh yeah, then Izapa, that may be right. I think it's a little bit south of the 14.8 degree line, as I recall, just a tiny little bit. But it's within the same band where you still would get the same two zeniths, although they've changed very slightly because of, again, the wobbling of the Earth. And those two dates are slightly different now, based on just, the different position in the Earth's orbit that they are in now.
I
Carl,
think those, I was just going to say that the locations of those places, Kopani, Sapa, and Takalikaba, they're all close enough that the zenith positions fall on the same 2 days
Yeah,
at those
absolutely.
locations. And I think
Yep.
that's the fundamental issue there.
I agree. I agree. Yes.
And
Also in the middle of Lake Atitlan and Samabach would have had the
exactly,
same exact alignment.
exactly. It's they're
sure,
all in the line.
And
Well,
it's that.
I mean, and the whole issue of the name of Retal Uleu,
Oh yeah, the
the
line and
line of the earth.
uh-huh, that's
It's
interesting.
the name of that. That's the nearest town to
It
Takaligaba.
is. It
It
is.
means the line of the earth. I think that's not accidental. Um,
Yeah, I love to think that that's true. And I remember Ahpub was, talking about that with us.
yeah, I think he was interested in that for sure.
Mhm.
Um, so, well, I mean, a whole other topic to touch on another time is the 311 peak formula
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and how in fact it is a demonstration from a different perspective of the Maya's knowledge of precession.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that really is what it is. But
Yeah, yeah.
there's a lot more
And,
to it
and
too.
you and
And
I
that,
became friends when we first exchanged
I
our,
know that's how we met.
it was
It's the whole
intersubjectivity once again.
it's
Yeah.
the whole issue of of Carl and I've been talking about it recently, the shift from the five sky to the six sky. The idea
Mm-hmm.
that the time was at one point subdivided into six units, each of which could be 13 baktuns. Or
Interesting.
11 baktuns, as a matter of fact, 6 times 11 versus
Right.
5 times 13, each representing a formula for the precession cycle. And they're
That's
both
interesting.
quite
Yeah,
close.
because sky can be used as a baktun.
As the baktun sign,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think there really is something there. I just haven't quite found it yet. I feel as though it's their calling to us.
Yeah, I have every
And it's
confidence that you will.
66 baktuns, excuse me, 66 baktuns versus 65 baktuns. Those are
Uh,
the units, I think,
Interesting.
which are both very close approximations,
To a whole cycle of
session
precession.
cycle.
That's right. Yeah, 33, the 311 peak or 33 baktuns would be half.
311 peak is the
Right.
half of that cycle,
Right,
exactly.
right. Yeah, I would love to kind of work on that with you. That sounds great.
Well, we could present on it sometime.
That would be
We
great.
could, in fact, you and I do a nice show if
Yeah, well, I know you and I and Carl, who's got his hand raised, also have been working on
and Carl
another thing that I had to set
and Carl
aside for a bit.
Carl has got a whole other set of things that he's
But
working
we have another really tantalizing bit of evidence about the sidereal year from Tikal, and I hope that we get to write that up soon. It's really, really beautiful, and uh, and and it also touches on what Hutch came up with too. And so Hutch has
on the
proposed
bones, the
a really
formula on the bones. Right.
wonderful interval of the sidereal year, a formula using 39 Hobbs and adding 10 days to it.
Mhm.
And I think we found some really smoking evidence for that in these Tikal bones.
Smoking hot.
Smoke it. Smoke it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that takes us to the Kobe. Oh,
Yeah.
I let a secret out. The mathematical term, the Kobe,
Oh,
is
we
the thing
can't.
which
Yeah.
changes. Is the thing which changes on
In
Erid.
the Arabase, yeah. Interesting. Yes, it is mentioned in those bones. Yeah. Carl, I'm dying to
Yeah,
know what's
I
up.
just had a quick, lots to talk about, but a quick comment on the rationale, and then I have a specific nerdy question about some numbers.
Okay.
Um, One, Lounsbury in his paper on the Temple of the Inscriptions panels and the explorations of deep time, when Pakal is doing those inscriptions that go into
Yeah.
fu far future 4772 and then back hundreds of thousands of years.
The square-nosed beast, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so he says that first and primary, the inscriptions are really about astrology and numerology, and he says that the history is just secondary
Yeah.
because he said when a ruler would plan an accession, he would gather his mathematician, his astronomers, and his astrologers together. And he says, okay, guys, what day is the best day for me to do this right ritual or
Hmm.
accession
Yeah.
would be the perfect accession day. And then the mathematicians and the astronomers would get together and they would back calculate and connect it to the birth of a god or to the accession of a god 200,000
Absolutely.
years in the past, and then connect it to the future as part of a jubilee. This is the rationale there that they were using because the divinity of the ruler, when he could attach his accession or his birth or her birth or accession to the accession of a primordial god,
Hmm.
that distance number between those two dates,
Hmm.
if it was could be embedded with full multiples of sacred cycles, that math proves the divinity, Lounsbury said.
Yeah. Yeah.
It proves that they are made of the same divine stuff.
Yeah. Divine charter. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's not just they're on the same birth date, but the calculus inside that distance number that connects those two dates, the eta how and the eta how,
Hmm.
that the mathematics is the proof of the divinity of the rule,
Hmm.
that he's
Hmm.
made of the same godly stuff as that God who he
Yeah.
shares a birth date with or
Yeah.
an accession date with. So that's what Lounsbury states loud and clear in
Yeah. Yeah.
the paper. And so again, the numerology, the astrology, and the mathematics are primary, but the
Mm.
reason we don't see them as primary is because we have this bias. We think it's about history,
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Western ideas of history. So
Yes.
that's just one comment. The
Yeah.
next,
No, I totally agree. I think that's
yeah,
absolutely
the
it. Yeah.
next nerdy question I have is that in your original Great Year paper, you quote a value, sidereal year value of 365, 2564103. And
Hmm.
that 64103 you haven't mentioned in your presentation here.
Really? Okay. That could be an omission on my part. Hold on. Let me see if I can find it. Uh,
Was the 365 was that a mean of a sidereal the mean of a sidereal year, or was that an exact value that you found in the
okay. So that's Hutch's proposal.
that's
I
Hutch
wanted to highlight that because
you
uh,
employ in your paper?
yeah, and actually, I mean, you can use it to then identify and confirm some of the all of the other sidereal year calculations. So the numbers that I give for different cycles of the sidereal year are based on however long the interval stated was, right? So there's the great cycle, the great year that I'm calling the Maya great year. That gives one value of the sidereal year if you use it as a whole multiple value. That, with the Haab being the the one that determines that. The whole cycle of the Haab when it returns back to the sidereal year. And if you just count that as a whole multiple of days and count that as a whole cycle of sidereal years, you get a particular value of a sidereal year, but you can get that same value within the day using the value that Hutch proposed in terms of 39 Haabs plus 10 days. You can get the same thing. It still will provide you the same, but then there's going to be a slight decimal with the Maya great year. So I do think, and as I said in the paper, I think that Hutch's proposal is correct. And I know Carlos Barrera Atesta came up with that value independently as well.
The reason I mention it is because with that value, I guess I can say a little bit about it, is I have found that value to be spot on another calculation at Palenque.
Awesome.
Great. I'll share that with you here shortly.
Please do.
And it's a beautiful calc. And
well, there's one that I know of that is spot on, and it's from the Temple of the Foliated Cross. And so it is that unusual 777 interval that I know Hutch Kinsman has also worked on, which does correspond to a meteor shower. And it is a beautiful example of that. And I think
it took me about 5 weeks to break it, but I believe it's correct.
Okay.
And I'll see you here shortly, and I think it's going to put a big smile on your face and Hutch Kinsman.
Appreciate it. Awesome.
And Carlos Barrera's face as well.
Yeah,
I mean,
and Ludendorff and turning in his grave, yes.
A nice confirmation that it's elsewhere in other calculations.
Yeah, no, I think it's really productive. And so in my original paper, when I was looking at Naranjo and Palenque and Copan, I came up with a proposal of, 365.55555, a repeating decimal, with a proposal about, adding a certain number of corrective days onto a multiple of Haab's. And that's what Hutch was actually playing with, and then found all of these cycles.
All right, good.
Divisible by 39, and that's where
I
it came
just need that clarification to know the origins and.
Yeah, so absolutely. Thank you for asking that. So there can be some difficulty in that I provide different numbers, different sidereal year values for whichever interval that we're looking at, to give you, what that, if used as a whole multiple of the sidereal year, then that's what you would get. That doesn't necessarily mean that is the value, that exact value that the Maya are using to target those dates. But you can find that, and I think that is that kind of, that key that we're looking for in terms of which is the value that they were using, these corrective values, and I think that's exactly what we found in those decal bones too.
Yeah, it's real great. Anyways, more to come. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Aaron, you want to ask your question? Aaron?
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey, I guess my camera's not working, but yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Michael, and I'm a huge fan of your work.
Thanks.
There's so many threads I'd like to pick up and follow with you, but I'll try to keep this focused since I think we're over 2 hours. And that you brought up the 29 calendar round tropical year theoretical calculation.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you're talking about T-Pulse tropical year.
It's 1,508 Hobbs equal, which
yes, that original, the old saw, as Barb calls it. Yes, so Thompson's 1,507 fit versus 15. Yeah.
And this is something I've worked on for a long time.
Okay.
It's actually it actually goes all the way back to 1906 and Charles Bowditch.
Okay, yeah. Uh-huh.
And I think the last really proper citation of this was Lounsbury in the 70s wrote, I think, an encyclopedia article.
Uh-huh.
And I think everybody since then who's brought this up has just been a little bit off in the way they've cited it.
Yes, I appreciate
either that or they just
cite
Lounsbury.
Yeah.
Yeah, it goes back to 1906, Charles Bowditch.
Okay. Uh-huh.
an article titled "The Temples of the Cross, of the Foliated Cross, and of the Sun at Palenque."
Great.
Um, and he's really, he's working in like almost a completely different paradigm of Mayan calendrics with,
Hmm.
he didn't have any of the resources that we're working with here.
Yeah, this is
Um,
pre-correlation and everything. Yeah.
so it's hard to it's hard to even like demonstrate what he was onto with like a short quotation or something, but I'll just read this one sentence. I think it's from page 8. Yeah, from
Okay.
page 8. And oh, and also since a couple times we've brought up the birth dates of the Ku at Palenque, the triad gods.
Uh-huh. The triad. Yeah.
So he was working with the dates of their birth.
Okay.
Um,
Which is actually half
approximate
of that 1507 cycle, right? From the air base to their birth. Yeah.
Right, so you knew that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That was what Thompson was onto also when he was talking about that in the 20s. And he may in fact have cited Bowditch actually. I
I
can't
don't
remember.
think he did though.
Not? So
I'm not even sure. Because I looked at that. Maybe I need to look at it closer. But in that 27 article, he's really kind of um, it's kind of roundabout the
okay.
way he mentions it.
Let's compare notes though, because I'm always very interested in the first of, going back to primary sources. So I really, really appreciate your tracing that back to Bowditch.
So this
Read
is
the
that one.
sentence. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so he's talking about those birth dates. This would seem to be a sufficient reason for the choice of this date, a date when just half a year of intercalary days was needed to
Hmm.
bring the seasons in the calendar into their true relations.
Excellent. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly it too. I think that's a
Yes.
rationale for that birth year.
Yeah,
I just want to jump in quickly on that if you
I might
don't
jump
mind.
in on Bowditch there real quick as well.
This is
Just
the 118,532 date, is it not, on the tablet of the cross?
There
Is
are
that
the three birth, they're all within the same year. The three birthdays
Exactly.
of all
Yeah.
three Ushluku.
Right.
but it's the specific date on the tablet of the cross, which is also the Petahi sixth sky, the completion of the sixth sky event.
Mm-hmm.
118,532. That's the long count date
Mm-hmm.
after Era Day. And I think that is the kickoff of that particular. I mean, that's the kickoff of those three births. But I wanted to ask: is it precisely half of 1507 and 1508?
I'm gonna get into that. I'll get into that. I think if you just give me a minute. But yeah,
Okay,
you're correct. It's 118,532, the 9 eek.
right, exactly. But it's the verb of that date, which is fascinating, and no one has really figured it out. I mean, it can be read, but it's not well understood. But it means the sixth sky is completed.
it's
Mm.
supplement. It's the pet verb. It's the encircled. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it means complete. It means something which goes around and comes back to the beginning point.
Mhm.
Um,
That sounds like astronomical cycles to me.
I think it's the actual closing of the original six sky formulation.
Mm.
Maybe even if I dare say it, the 66 Baktun system,
Mm. Wow.
which comes to kind of a convenient end that interval after Era Day.
Uh-huh.
I mean, but again, I can't prove it. It's just my suspicion. But
Okay.
I guess my question is it in fact precisely half of that 1507 1508 formula?
As I recall, it's not exactly half a year, but the year itself is 754 Hobbs after era, and
Okay,
which is
is that
half
what
of
it is?
1508. And
There's
so,
there's more.
go ahead.
Um,
Yeah, go ahead.
so I don't think it was past Bowditch, Thompson, and Teeple. I don't think the idea was really advanced until Alonso Mendez and Carol Karasik
Yeah.
um, published an art. I think it's been like officially published in 2014. I
Uh-huh.
have an older version of it, and they're citing Lounsbury, so it is a proper citation there. And there's a paragraph here that I can read from it. I think that'll make things more clear into how intentional this was.
Mm-hmm.
So they say, as Lounsbury, 1978, page 807, noted, the birth dates of the Palenque Triad, 754 years after creation, actually refer to the first calendar year since the beginning of the cycle, where the equinoxes or solstices would be reversed with respect to the 365-day year. Hidden in the account of the birth of the gods is a subtle reference to the tropical year drift cycle, which equals 2 times 754 or 1508 calendar years of 365 days. During the first half cycle from the date of creation to the birth of the gods, the sun drifted from its position at zenith to nadir passage. In other words, along with the reversal of the equinoxes and solstices was the reversal of the cosmic axis, zenith and nadir. And here's where it gets real good. 4 cycles of 754 years after the divine births in 2360 BC brings us to AD 656, the height of Haab Pakal's career. And so I found some interesting things jumping off of that, which is the year in which the Tzolk'in were born is an 8 Manik year. Pakal was born on the 13th day of an 8 Manik year, or 14th. And then if you add 1 calendar round from the year of Pakal's birth, that's when you reach the 8 Manik year that is the 2 cycles of the tropical year drift. And that date, 0 Manik, I'm sorry, 0 Pope, 8 Manik. I have the exact long count here of it somewhere. Anyway, if you go 260 days before that, you come to the long count date 9, 11, 1, 12, 7. And that is exactly between 2 dates that are the earliest dates recorded at Palenque's palace. The House E Subterraneos. The earliest dates recorded there are 9, 11, 1, 12, 6, 7 Kimi, and 9, 11, 1, 12, 8, 9 Lamat. So that's like a 3-day interval, and they don't actually write it, but right in the center of that is the 8 Manik date that is exactly 260 days before this like incredibly crucial calendar round return.
Interesting.
And I think that's exactly there are all these layers of indirection. So they're not actually writing the date 8 Manik because it's like too special. And they're also not even putting it right on at the beginning of the year. They're going back 260 days. I think it's exactly the same kind of thing that Ludendorff in that quote where it said the inscriptions were supposed to remain incomprehensible because these are like really sacred things that they're dealing with, and they're not just gonna put them out there. They have to like hide them. They have to like wrap them,
Yeah. And so to be discovered. Yeah, it's an interesting proposal. I'd love to see it written down if you send it to me by email.
Yeah. And there's
Yeah.
just one other little key to it is that your work with the Tikal bones, where they have the inscription of 52 tunes plus 13 days,
Yeah.
that is also 260 days
That's
shy.
exactly right. So you're familiar with that. Yes, that's definitely something interesting. And that dovetails onto the work that Carl and Barb and I have been working on with these other bones that are in that same real 116 collection. But yeah, so that cycle, which was exactly 260 days prior to 13 days after a calendar round, is what you're referring to, and that.
And I think in your work there's also another, it's not at the top of my mind, but I think there's another like tropical year calculation where it's 260 days short in the same
Yeah,
kind of way.
exactly. And I think what those they serve a purpose of being able to tell you that they're not just talking about 13 days later. They're talking about 52 years plus 13 days later. And that's how they're able to tell you that, by doing it 260 days before. So it is quite a bit distant from the era base. It's 52 years after the era base, shy of 260 days,
Yeah.
60, basically 252 tropical years after the era base, but 260 days prior. So it's one way that they can do that instead of just giving you a long count date, which is just the same as 13 days after the era base.
Yeah.
So I think
And it
that's
all started at Izapa.
Aaron, I wanted to give a shout out actually to Bowditch here. People don't know Bowditch's work because he was a rich industrialist, and he actually financed the Kopan excavations, and he was responsible to working out all of these thorny calendrical problems with the calendar. And he wrote an introduction to Maya hieroglyphic writing that's never referenced or rarely read, and it's on the internet. I encourage everybody to get Bowditch's introduction to hieroglyphic writing, a copy of it, because he systematically lays out the calculus and also the calendar, and that systematic layout is copied then. He does this, I think, in 1910. That's then copied by Morley in 1916, and then Thompson, later. So we owe this massive debt of gratitude to Bowditch, and yet he's lost to obscurity. But
Yeah.
when you look at his introduction to Maya hieroglyphic writing, which is mostly mathematics, calculus, and, as Aaron noted, astronomy, you will be thunderstruck, or gobsmacked, I should say, how just good it is. And what's great is they had to do it all by hand back then. And he shows you step by step how to do these calculations by hand, including deep time and astronomical calculations. So it's extremely valuable source. And I would encourage everybody to get that free digital copy of Bowditch's.
Thank you, Carl. Yeah, I agree. And the same thing goes for Ludendorff. I think we've really just passed him over, and you can only get his work in German, really. And I think that we really need to translate it into English, acknowledging that he's using an incorrect correlation, but a lot of the correlation-free calculations that he has in there are golden. And I think they stand the test of time. And I think Thompson really just poo-pooed Ludendorff because he used the spin correlation, but
because he was German as well, and
yes, absolutely,
fought against the Germans in the trenches in World War I. So
that's right. Well, his brother was a prominent Nazi also, so there was that. Yeah,
but yeah, he did the same thing with Bayer. He treated him just horribly because Bayer was a Nazi sympathizer as well. And Thompson hated Nazis, so it is.
Yeah, but their work actually I think holds up, and if you can look at things that are correlation free that still stand, I think we absolutely owe it to ourselves and to them to look at those and really entertain them. So I'm trying to bring those out into circulation at least now. But thank you for saying that about Bowditch.
Yeah,
and thank you to Aaron as well for what.
Yeah, if I could just add one final piece to that, complete the puzzle, as it were. As I mentioned, Pakal was born 52 years during an 8 year before the second return of the 29 calendar rounds, since the birth of the triad. and he was born on the 13th day, or he was born on 13 Pope of that year.
Hmm.
And so if you um, start, if you, how is it, how does this, because there's that the T column decipherment, like the interpretation that you've made,
Hmm.
where it's 52 years plus 13 days.
Hmm.
So the day of the um it would be 13 Pope in the year that
Hmm.
Pakal turned
Right.
52, which is the year of the 29 calendar rounds
Okay,
return.
you got my attention now.
Yeah,
Pretty cool. Yeah, so
that is
it is a 52 tropical
the
years.
tropical anniversary of that 8 year that
Right.
he was born in.
That's pretty groovy. Yeah, cool. Thank you. I appreciate that, and thank you for reading my obscure publications from when I was.
Yeah, man, I am such a huge fan of your work. I think everybody who's been at this presentation, just to let everybody know, as like dense with amazing information as this has been, like all of Michael's work, to me at least, is like that. Well, I just think you're doing great work.
I'm so flattered. Thank you. It means so much to me to hear that because I work in relative obscurity with just a few really good colleagues like Barb and Carl and others, and I don't really get to hear that. So I am very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing the timing today too, because it's March 24th, which is, I believe, the Gregorian day of Pakal's birth.
That is a good, a good,
And
good day to
the dates
celebrate.
you're working with too, with U Kokan, they're
Uh,
very similar to the 8 Monique and 13 Pope dates. They're
mm,
all around like mid to late March.
they are, and yeah, I'm very interested in that sidereal position, as I mentioned a bit about that zero pope date, which is the accession date for U Kokan, which is positioned in the very same sidereal position as February 8th in the Arabase year. So there's that kind of opposition between August 13th and February 8th, August 13th and February 8th that continuously shows up. And all of those sidereal parallels place the births of U Kokan as well as the accession, it's all, well, the accession on zero pope, I should say, of course, is 17 days after the sidereal position of February 8th. So that February 8th date has been something I've been sniffing out for quite a while, and so I hope to get that Yashkin paper presented. I think February 8th shows up over and over as a tropical year position in Kopan with ruler 12. Kakutiwitz Kawil, who was his accession, is on February 8th, and then they commemorate it 24 years later in Kopan, and it's everywhere. It's in the Dresden Codex.
And yeah, Venus.
You got it. You got it.
Yeah.
So, and it's that Yashkin date, I think, from Takalika Bach and on altar 12, I think, is absolutely being commemorated there as well. So, yeah, cool.
Okay, just one last thing, because Pete, you were talking about John Major Jenkins.
Uh-huh.
Um, I know he was really excited about something that you found out at Copan in 2012, like a decipherment or decoding that you
Yeah,
made.
yeah.
I was wondering,
So,
will we ever
right.
get that from you?
In a severely edited form, perhaps. Yeah, so I mean, some of the difficulty that I've had is that I need to get some things published first before I can build on them with the other things that I then found and proposed. And it's hard to just jump forward to some of these things without providing the context. And I feel like my job before I leave this planet is to kind of hold people's hands to try to explain this as well as I can. I don't know if I'm up to the task, but I'm going to give it my best. Today was a test of me to really see if I could do this, and I had to actually brush up on some of this stuff that I hadn't been looking at this stuff for a few years. But yeah, the interval that I think you might be referring to is on Copan Stela C, and there is a deep time interval there that is quite amazing and interesting, and I'm still puzzling it over. I had a proposal, I think, back in that time when Barb and I and John Major Jenkins and David Sadat were all in Copan on December 21st of 2012, because we were interviewed in this documentary together that Shannon Kring, I believe is her name. She had done and generously, had invited us to present. So we were all being celebrated, and at this big giant outdoor soccer field where they showed this, this documentary, and our heads were like, 50 feet tall, and our heads were about to explode. Anyway, it was this amazing date, on December 21st, 2012, and it was a really beautiful time, I think, and that was at the moment, I think I was presenting, Barb was presenting, and John was presenting. And in my presentation, I talked about Stela C and some of the things that I had proposed at that time in terms of sidereal positions and tropical year positions. And hopefully, yes, I will now you've reminded me that I have to jump on that one too. And so see if I can get that out the door. But all in good time.
You
right,
mentioned
thank you.
David, you mentioned David Salat and John, but Mary Lou Ridinger,
Yeah.
Jay Ridinger, they gifted John and I with a beautiful little pendant made of bone with 3 pieces of jadeite, and it was a replica of a piece that David Sadat excavated out of the tomb that he excavated at Copan. And it was supposedly representative of like the sun being birthed, the whole thing.
Yeah, it's a Cayman. Yeah, I was the lucky recipient of one too, and I was indoctrinated into the Maya Galactic Society, I think she called it. And yeah, she gave me one in 2012 as well, and she was very sweet in that she hosted me and John for Christmas that year, right after December 21st. Because I had to lead a trip, and I had to have somewhere to go, and she invited us over, and it was really quite nice. And she gave me one as well. So
She was at my Zoom 2 weeks ago, but she hasn't showed up tonight. But you mentioned a book, and I think the second author was Carol. She's here tonight. I'm wondering,
Oh, I see Carol. I didn't see that she was here. I just see her name now. Hi, Carol.
Carol, would you like to unmute and say anything? Maybe she's not right in front of her computer.
It's quite all right. It's quite all right. I'm glad she's here.
Yeah. And what was the name of the book? It was
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not sure.
maybe yeah, all right. Well, anyway, Michael, this has been fantastic. Really something. We'll get a lot of mileage out of the recording, I'm sure. Thanks for everybody for not only showing up, but those of you who raised your hands and talked in person, and Carl and Barb and everybody. Elaine, you're here and still hanging on. Nice to say hello to you and David.
And hello to Elaine and David as well. I'm glad you're here. So, and
All
I
right.
see Randa here as well. And thank you everybody for coming. It's been an honor. And thank you, Jim, and thank you, Barb, for recommending me to talk about this paper. I really appreciate it. It's been good for me to dip my toes back in, and it's nice to know that it is appreciated. So I very much appreciate your work as well, and all of you who have shown up today and taken some time out. Thanks.
Thanks for watching this Aztlander presentation. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander magazine of the Americas, contact your host Jim Reed at jimreedmaya@gmail.com. Thanks again.